Welcome back. So in this video, what I'm going to focus on is automated database testing, of course. So in order to make sure that we're on the same page, what I'm going to first do is set up a database and a user in SQL Server Management Studios, because we're going to be testing SQL Server databases. So I'm going to connect to my database engine, my local host, which is named my servers, whose name is core. I'm going to go to security, logins, and I'm going to right click and create a new login. I'm going to name the login test user, and I'm going to give them the password test123, test123. And I'm going to take off enforce password policy. I'm going to go to my securables, user mappings. Actually, server role, and I'm going to make them a sysadmin. Okay. Next, I'm going to go to my databases. I'm going to right click my database folder, right click, new database. So I'm going to create a database called testdb. This is going to be the database we're going to run all our tests on. And I'll click OK. And I will add this user to this database. So test user, and they're an owner. Okay, they're added. I will check to see that they could view all the databases under my securables. So they can view the databases, they can connect to the database, and okay. So now that that's set up, I'm going to connect with this new user using SQL Server Authentication. Username test user, password test123, connect. And we're connected, and boom. So now with my new user, I'm going to right click on the database and go new query. It's loading. And I'm going to create a table. Create table, test table. I'm going to create an ID column, int primary key, it'll be identity column. I will create a varchar column called text, called name, varchar max, text data, varchar max, and num, which will be an int. Okay, so we have created a test table, and we will be using the structure in order to perform all our tests. So let's get started. Okay, so now we're going to get to the automated testing setup. First, I'm going to start up PyCharm, my IDE for creating tests. I'm going to, now that it's started up, I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to call this project MS SQL database test, and I will create it. And right now it's loading. Now that the project has finished loading, I'm going to go to View, Tool Windows, Terminal. And that will give me a bash shell in my test project directory. Next, what I'm going to do is create 3 folders in my project window within PyCharm. So I right click, new directory. I'll call the first directory results, enter. The second directory will be called resources, and the third directory will be called tests. So this is the basic structure of our project. Next, what I'm going to do is create a file under resources called database connection.robot. Robot is the file extension for robot framework files. So I'll create this file first. I will go OK. And I've created the file. It'll say plugins supporting star.robot files are found. I'll install the plugins. As you can see, it says it's showing me IntelliBot and robot framework support for PyCharm. So that'll basically integrate it with the actual framework that's been installed. I go OK. So IntelliBot basically finds, it's basically like code completion. So if you enter in a partial string, it'll give you code hints. Okay, so now within the tests folder, I'm going to create a new directory, and I'm going to call it table level tests. Okay. Then I'm going to create another directory, and I'm going to call it proc level tests. So basically, by using the structure and using subdirectories, you can organize your test files into different folders for better, for easier organization. So as you can see, my main folder level has 3 folders called resources, results, and tests. The test folder will hold all basically the test code. The resources folder will hold libraries and connection strings information, and my results folder will hold the output/results of my tests. So now under the table level tests folder, what I'm going to do is right click and click and create a new file. I'm going to call this file test table.robot. So within this file, I'm going to have all the tests for this database table under testDB. So now I've gone to my resources folder and gone to the file database connection.robot. These statements at the beginning of the code are libraries, which are similar to includes in other programming languages. So basically, if you need additional functionality like the ability to deal with databases, which isn't provided by the robot framework language out of the box, you have to write a piece of code that gives the program access to something called a library, which will help it know how to deal with databases. Sort of like if you actually don't know something, you go to the library and pull out a book, and it'll teach you information about whatever subject you're interested in. The concept is very similar. So whenever I want to have, let's say, access to dealing with databases, I would say at the top of my code, library double space, because the double space in the robot framework basically is used in between different operators or variables in order to say that this is not a part of the same statement. This is a separate command or a separate value. So as you can see here, I just typed in library followed by a double space, and I'm typing in database library, which is giving my program access to the database library I installed previously. Piece of code, I have included 3 libraries. The first library is database library. As I said before, this gives my program or segment of code access to dealing with databases, the ability to deal with databases. The second is string. That gives my code the ability to deal with strings, and dialogues, which will allow me to log within my code. So right here I have my variables. You can think of variables like temporary containers in which you can put values into and or change / modify. Think of it like a bucket. A bucket can hold either water, a ball, paper, and various other things. And you can swap things out, or you can change whatever you have within the bucket by modifying it. In the same manner, you can think of variables. They're just containers for a value. In Robot Framework, a variable has the structure of $ bracket, variable name, closing bracket. So my database name is testdb. My username is testuser, if we remember from before. The password is test123. The database host is core, and the port number, SQL's database port by default is 1433. It might differ based on your setup because you could actually change the port. As you can see, what I did just now with the variables is I had the variable name. I used the equal sign in order to load a value into it, into this variable, which I'm going to highlight right now. So on the right side of the equal sign is the value I want to assign to the variable, and on the left side is the actual variable that will contain this value going forward. To draw your name to something of high importance with regards to Robot Framework, and it's the spacing. So the space between the variable name and the equals, there's only one space. However, the space between the equals and the actual value will have 2 spaces. In Robot Framework, in between parameters, you have 2 spaces usually. So keep this in mind, because if you don't get the spacings right, your program won't compile, and then you'll run into a lot of problems. This documentation page, which can be found online, has information regarding the database library API, the commands associated with it, and how to use them. In order to find this page, all you have to do is go to Google, and you can type in Robot Framework. It'll bring up a list of links, and what you want to do is click on the Robot Framework link. On the Robot Framework page, you would go to Libraries, then you would click on External, the External tab. Then under the list of links that shows up, what you would do is go to Database Library, and in brackets, Python. Then you would click on the API you're interested in reading about from the page you are taken to. As you can see, there's an API header. I want to look at 0.6 API, and you are brought to the page full of all the commands associated with that library. So by doing this for any library, you can get the list of commands that you have to deal with. When looking for the commands, the database library of Robot Framework, as you can see, there's a keywords table, and I have a list of keywords. And then I have the arguments that this keyword takes, followed by documentation on how it works. In first command/keyword that is of importance to us at the moment, since we want to test out our SQL Server database, is connect to database. As you can see here, it says it takes in the following parameters: our API module name, our database name, our username, password, our host name, our port, and a configuration file. But some of these parameters are optional, like the configuration file. An explanation of this is told here. So let's get started. This connection string right over here is how I would connect to SQL Server or establish a connection. Connection string that I'm using to connect to the database is exactly as was shown in documentation, in the documentation webpage that I showed you earlier. This is the command followed by 2 spaces, and here is the reference to the API driver that is used, followed by 2 spaces, and then we have the first variable input parameter followed by 2 spaces, the second variable input parameter followed by 2 spaces, and a third, and so on, until we have all the information that is needed. So let's get started with actually making the robot framework do something. As you can see here, I've set up a small segment of code, which I will include these test cases in a link that you could download from. So here I have a header that says keywords. This is important to follow this what looks like a comment's name, because it has much more meaning. So under keywords in this file, I have connect followed by a new line, and in that new line I have tags testdb, which is telling me what database this is referring to, and then I have a command connect to database, and everything else that goes along with that command as we covered earlier. Then I have disconnect command followed by a keyword. All these commands are referenced in the database documentation online that I showed you earlier. Then I have a get input data followed by loading data from a user input. So I see get value from user space enter data, and then I set a local variable to have the value that was referenced in the data to loaded variable that got information from the user. And I have a final keyword, insert record, which inserts into the table this variable data to load, which has the input from the user with a 0. So that is my database connection file, and I've basically defined a set of commands, keywords, in this file that can be used to interact with the database from other files. In my testtable.robot directory, I have a reference to the resource file called database.connection.robot, which is what we were just looking at. Usually I'd have this resource file in a resources folder. However, the actual API that I downloaded seems to be having difficulty as of this current version looking for the resource file in the resources folder. I'm not sure what's going on, but when I moved it into the test folder, it worked like it usually does. Then I have a command that says test setup, and so for every test, what will happen is that it's going to connect to the database, and after every test it has a test teardown command, and it disconnects from the database in order to limit connections. So here is a single test case. As you can see, I have the test cases header, which is important. followed by insert a record, which is the name of the test case. And then on the next line, I have a tab space, followed by database connection, which is referring to the resource file, followed by the keyword get input from data. So when I have this on a single line, what it does is it goes to the database resource file shown here, and then it goes to the get input data from user, and then it will run the code underneath the get input data from user keyword, and it'll until the next keyword is hit. So basically this is like a function, and the function start is defined by the spacing, just like in Python file. And then I have another command referencing the database connection resource file, and it has insert record. So as you can see here, it inserts into a table the record. So in order to actually run this test script, what you would do is go to the root directory of the test script in the terminal window, which we opened up when we first set up PyCharm. As you can see, we are in the root, and I have a test folder there. And then you would type in pybot space -d space results. What this does is it defines where the output of the tests is going to be saved. So -d space results is telling you the directory where the output of the tests will be stored. And then I put in another space, and in this space I specify the folder, and after this space I specify the folder where the tests are contained. So I would put in tests. Then I would press enter, and the tests would run. So it's running, and it started. And because I had a keyword with in my database connection folder which asks for input from the user, I'm going to put in input from the user. So I'm going to enter it into my test case, so it saves into that variable that I showed you earlier. Video example is what I'm going to put in there. Now I'm going to click OK. It's an input box, and basically now it ran this first test case. So as you can see here, we got the input from the user, and it's inserted the record, so it inserted into this table. So now let's go and check the table in SQL Server. And as you can see, the input we put in was stored. If that input didn't work, what would have happened is that the test would have failed. So now if you go to, in Windows Explorer, if you go to where your test is actually stored and go to the results folder, you'll see that there's a log8.html, an output.xml, and a reports.html. If you open up these HTML pages in a browser, what you will see is it'll tell you if all the tests passed or not. So in this case, all the tests were passed, total passed. There were no failures. If you want more details regarding how the tests proceeded, you can go to the top of this file and see a link called log.html, which is the log file we just saw in the folder. Click it, and it tells you the name of the test. So we had a test called insert a record, and as you can see here, here's the test with the name insert a record. And so it proceeded smoothly, and it tells you all the individual commands and the keywords that were used during this test. If it failed, it'll even take a snapshot and show you what failed, and it'll tell you where exactly it failed. So by doing this, you could basically run tests. I think I'm going to end this video here for now. In the next video, I will show examples of more complicated tests. Yeah, so I'll see you soon if you're interested. But I think this is enough to figure out the rest of how to create test cases and how things work by yourself. But I will provide a more detailed explanation soon.